In this lab, we will be setting physical rules. New designs use a 5mm line width as a default trace width. This design requires a 9mm line width for all non-critical, non-special nets on the external layers and a 7mm default line width on internal layers. So we open up our Allegro editor and we see that our unplaced board is already loaded. And we go to Setup, Constraints, Physical. The Constraint Manager form opens up and the physical section is displayed. Check to make sure that all layers are displayed, and this is usually the default, but it's a good idea to check it. Expand the default physical constraint set so all the different layer types are visible. We do this by clicking, clicking, and clicking. The conductor top and bottom will be 9, and that changes the top and the bottom. And the conductor internal will be 7. And we see that changed both the internal 1 and the internal 2, which is correct. The plane layers will get a width of 7. And that takes care of that. So at this point, your form should look like this one. Sometimes we need special physical rules, and I would say most of the time this is the case. We're going to assume nets VCLKA and VCLKC requires 8mm lines instead of the standard 7 or 9. We also want the minimum neck width to be the same as the line width. So the conductor will be 9, and the plane will be 7, and the conductor will be 7 as well. So this will not allow any minimum width in addition to the regular line width. We will now add another physical constraint set called 8mm line. So we go to Objects, and then we go to Create, and then we go to Physical Constraint Set. And the physical constraint set that we're going to call this 8mm line. So we add that in this line here. We say OK, and that falls right into there. And the line width we want is 8mm line. So we put that right in here. And the, of course, the neck is the same. We're just going to put an 8 in here as well. That takes care of our 8mm line width. Now that you've created the physical routing rules for the special nets, you need to assign vClockA and vClockC nets to a net class and assign that class to use 8mm line physical C set. We go to Constraints, Physical, All Layers, and what we can do here is go vClock asterisk, and that will bring up any nets that is VCLK, and it just happened to bring up the 2 that we wanted. So we'll click on it, and we're going to bring it down and release it. Then we go right click, and then we'll go into Create and Class. In this particular one, we're going to call this Sync, and we want to make sure that this is checked because we want to create both a physical and a spacing constraint set, and we're going to call this Sync. And that being done, we click OK. When the nets are assigned to a net class, they're removed from the section listing all the nets and they're put under the net class's object type. Scroll to the top of the Constraints Manager form and see Net Class Sync you just created. We go to Physical Constraint Set by Layer, and Net is all layers. And we see that this is our new class, and we see that there's two nets involved in it. And if we click it, we see that we have V clock A and V clock C, and all we have to do now is assign it 8 mil line and 8 mil line. We now close the Constraint Manager, and we can save the board to constraints. And I believe if we did save, it is constraints.board is here. We're just going to overwrite it. That's fine. Now that we have the physical rules set, we will set the default spacing rules. Open the constraints.board and choose Setup and Constraints and Spacing. So if we go to our conductor constraint set and we click and hold and go all the way to the end of the line, and we put in a 9 mil space, 9 and an enter, and that will take care of the conductor. Now we want a 7 mil space for the plane and the conductor. So if we go all the way to the beginning and we want to click on plane, bring hold and all the way here, all the way to the end, like there, and then we put in 7, and that will take care of that. And they're all there. And the 8 mil space, well, guess what? That's going to be 8 mils. So again, we press and hold and bring the cursor all the way to the end. And then you click here, put in 8 and an enter, and that takes care of that. And if we go and we expand everything, we see everything is exactly correct. When you created the Sync Net class in the Physical Rules section, you also created a class in both the physical domain and the spacing domain. All that is left to do now is to assign Sync Net class to use the 8 mil space rule that you just created. So in order to do that, we go to Net All Layers, and we see that we have Sync. And let's expand it. And then we just go to the class and we see that it has default, but what we want is 8 mil space. And we see that both nets C clock A and C clock C has the 8 mil space. And we can now click out of our Constraint Manager. We're back into our board and we just say File Save. We will now set up a class-to-class rule. Our objective is to create a new class of nets and set a class-to-class rule. Let's assume that the nets VD0 to VD7 are critical and they must not interfere with the sync nets VClock A and VClock C. The spacing required between these two nets and sync nets must be 15 mils at a minimum. You will create a new 15 mil space rule, assign the VD nets to a new net class, and create a class-to-class rule between the VD nets and the sync nets using the new 15 mil space rule. First, you must create the new spacing rule. We go to Constraints and Spacing, and we click All Layers. We click the default cell, and then we go to our Objects, and we go to Create, and spacing C-set. And we're going to call this 15 mil space. And we type that in and we say OK. And we click on the 15 mil space row and we click here and we type in 15 and enter. And that changes the entire 15 mil space row. So now we will assign nets to a new net class. Now that you have created the spacing routing rules for the special nets, you need to assign VD to a net class. And click OK. We go to Objects and Create and Class. We type in VD nets. We do not want to create both physical and spacing. And VD nets are right here. We now right-click on VD nets and we say Net Class Members. And in the filter, we'll put a VD asterisk. And if we go to Nets, we see VD0 all the way to 7. And let's highlight all of those. And then we'll put them in here. And then we just say OK. All the VD nets are under the VD net class. The final step is to create a class-to-class rule between the sync and the VD nets. And we will use the 15 mil space rule that we created, and we will use the C-set assignment matrix workbook to perform the task. So we go to the spacing, and we see that we have a C-set assignment matrix right here. We'll click on that. The sync to VDD nets is actually the 15 mil space. And the VD nets to VD nets is still the default. So now, anytime the sync net is routed next to a VD net, the air gap between the two nets will be 15 mils. And we can now choose File Close in this constraint manager. And we can now save the board. File, Save. And we will overwrite. Fine. And we have concluded the end of this lesson.